Welcome, everybody, to the Foreign Correspondents Club latest Zoom event. As you know, we're doing these events Zoom-wise, while we are not being able to have events in the FCC club, but we're very happy to be able to put these events on now. Before I get to today's really exciting event, I just want to flag you to a couple of things we have upcoming. Please keep an eye on fcchk.org on our website, or please look at our Twitter account, which is at FCCHK, if you want to find out all of the great things we've got upcoming. But I can tell you now that we've got on Friday, August 7th, Noam Chomsky, one of the great public intellectuals of the world, is going to be with us right here in the Zoom room in Hong Kong. And he's going to be talking on the topic of Trump, capitalism, and the U.S. role in the new Cold War. So please do tune in for that. That's going to be a morning event on Friday, August 7th at 8 a.m. And then coming up on Monday, August 10th, we are going to have Kishore Mahbubani. Many of you know Kishore. He's been a diplomat. He's been an intellectual and academic in Singapore. He's going to be talking to us on Monday on the whole question of his new book, which is the title of his new book, Has China Won? He's going to be talking about the new Cold War and the topic of has China won? But for today, right now, we're really excited to have Suzanne Nossel, who's joining us all the way from New York City. She's the head of PEN America, but she's also had a lot of other jobs in her lifetime. She's the chief executive of PEN America now, but she was chief operating officer of Human Rights Watch, and she was an executive director of Amnesty International in the U.S. She served the Obama administration. She was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Organizations. She also worked in the Clinton administration. She's a regular contributor to Foreign Policy. She writes regularly for pretty much every newspaper you've heard of. But we're going to be speaking with her now about her latest book and her discussion on this new topic, which is really interesting, which is about defending free speech during this age of a racial reckoning going on. Her new book is called Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. She's going to be talking to us about how you balance free speech with this new, what some people might call cancel culture or the reckoning with racial justice going on. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the moderator, who is our vice president of the Foreign Correspondents Club, Eric Wishart, who's been with AFP, Agence France Presse, for many, many years, holding many hats. He's going to be our moderator, and he's going to be fielding all the questions and talking to Suzanne Nossel. So without further ado, here's Eric Wishart.
Thank you, Keith, and welcome everybody. And thanks for joining us this morning, New York time, Suzanne. And we're very honored to be part of your Zoom book tour. I know that you're doing a tour of America, but I think it's on Zoom. So good to see you this morning. Yeah. So I just wanted to open by asking you, what is PEN America actually? What do you do? What's the organization's role?
Yeah, sure. So we have an integrated mission at PEN America to both celebrate and defend free expression worldwide. And we're an organization of writers. So we have 7,500 writers and other literary professionals, editors, publishers, journalists who make up our backbone. And we're part of an international network of PEN organizations around the world. And so on the literary side, we do a whole host of public programs. Now, of course, they're all on Zoom, but normally we do a big festival in New York City every year called the PEN World Voices Festival that brings in writers from all over the world for an intensive week of dialogue with American writers. We give out the US's most comprehensive program of literary awards across many different genres in a big celebration that we do. We actually held this year is right in the beginning of March. It was sort of one of the last mass gatherings in New York City. We had 1,100 people there. Thankfully, it at least didn't become notorious as a super spreader event. And we very much hope it wasn't. And then we do programs to elevate and amplify lesser heard voices. So we have a very robust prison and justice writing program for writers who are individuals who are incarcerated who want to learn how to write and be mentored. And then another one for dreamers, young undocumented students in the US. And then the other side of our work really is free expression advocacy. And that's how, of course, you and I got to know each other when we first came to Hong Kong some years ago to release a report on encroachments on press freedom in Hong Kong. We've done another one, did a subsequent one on the disappearance of the booksellers. And we work around the world on both the cases of individuals who are persecuted and punished for what they write. So we try to get them out of prison, get the charges dropped, stand by their side, publicize their cases, work with other organizations and government entities. And then we work on a whole series of free speech policy issues, including online harassment, press freedom. There's a crisis in local news in the US that's become sort of a major issue for us, campus free speech, and a number of other areas. So we've got offices in Los Angeles and Washington, and a network of members and chapters across the country.
And I just wanted to say, of course, any of our viewers who want to ask a question, there's a function to send us your questions. So, and of course, one of your very distinguished members of PEN, I think, is Salman Rushdie, who, if I'm correct, Suzanne.
Yes, I mean, he was championed by PEN during the years of the fatwa and had many allies in the literary community who stood with him, who pushed bookstores not to stop carrying his books, who offered him solidarity and moral support and tangible forms of support. And then when he became more free, he became the president of PEN America. And actually it was he who started the PEN World Voices Festival during his tenure in the years after 9/11, out of concern that the US, about a resurgent neo-isolationism in the US, and a belief that writers could build bridges and sustain connections to the rest of the world. So that's what that festival's about.
So I wanted to start, of course, by talking about your book, and then I think we'll also get to China and Hong Kong. But in the first instance, I just wanted, was there a particular reason you wrote this book? And I've read your book. Was there a particular reason why you wrote it at this time? Did you say to yourself, I got to get this down? It's a fascinating read, and I would certainly recommend anybody who ever speaks in public, or anybody who speaks to anybody in any context, should read it, because it really examines a lot of questions that we face on a daily basis now. So was there a particular context that made you decide to write it?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it grew out of a couple things. You know, one experience that I had as an official at the US State Department, when I was charged with working on an issue known as the defamation of religion. And that was a campaign by the Organization of the Islamic Conference, so the Islamic majority countries represented at the UN. And they had, in the wake of the Danish cartoons controversy, which I'm sure some of your members remember, where these cartoons, satirical cartoons of the Muslim prophet Muhammad, were published in a Danish newspaper, Jyllands-Posten. And in the wake of that, there was great upset and uproar in the Muslim community, and there were riots outside of Danish diplomatic installations around the world, really shocking the Danes. And it was, you know, it's sort of a powerful and violent outburst in which some people lost their lives. And in the wake of that, these Islamic delegations had come together and said, we need to do something about intolerance toward Muslims around the world. And the something that they came up with was an official ban on the so-called defamation of religion. So they wanted an international prohibition on things like those satirical cartoons, but also criticism of religion, mockery of religion. And as the United States and working together with the Western delegations and the Europeans, we were very much against this. We viewed it as a clear infringement on free speech. And so what happened was, year after year, we would battle with them. Once a year in Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council, once at the UN General Assembly in New York, over this resolution. And we were marshaling votes on our behalf and campaigning. And it just seemed to me like the most fruitless exercise you could imagine. You know, the net result was doing nothing. It was just creating friction between these countries. And in fact, as the US, you know, we cared about intolerance toward Muslims. This is the early days of the Obama administration. We had a brand new envoy to the Muslim world. We had people working to build bridges with Muslim communities across the United States. And so for us to be, sort of at war with this agenda at the UN, to me, did not make a lot of sense. And we ended up turning it around. And actually, I went to Pakistan and we proposed a set of practical measures to address the underlying problem of religious intolerance. So things like dialogue and education and bringing experts together, including hate crimes prosecutors from the US Justice Department who would meet with counterparts from around the world. And eventually, it was a little slow going, but eventually we got an international consensus. So all 190 plus delegations at the UN got behind this other approach, and the Islamic Conference stopped trying to introduce their defamation resolution. And for me, what that sparked was a recognition that these tensions between the drive for a more inclusive, equal, less bigoted, less racist society can and must be reconciled with robust protections for free speech. They shouldn't come at the expense of free speech. And ultimately, the Islamic delegations were not trying to attack free speech. They were trying to protect themselves and amplify their concerns about being targeted in the post 9/11 period. And the crossing over into an infringement on free speech, I won't say it was incidental, but it wasn't their main purpose. And if you could get them to recognize that, it actually turned out to be possible to demonstrate that their concerns could be met more effectively through other means. And there's a parallel to what we've seen on campuses in the United States over the last few years, where there's a very powerful drive to make the campuses more equal and inclusive, less racist. And this has obviously come to a head in the last few months with the protests over racism and the murder of George Floyd. And yet again, there's this propensity to cross over into censoriousness. And you can understand where it comes from, because people are trying to protect the vulnerable, and there's hateful speech and expression that can be menacing and targeting. And so the impulse is, well, shouldn't we shut that down, suppress that, punish that? And to me, the answer is no. But I really wanted to set that out and explain. I sort of say the book is an attempt to explain how we can live together in our diverse, digitized, and divided society without curbing free speech. Because I believe fundamentally we do need to become a more equal, inclusive, and just society, but that it need not and should not come at the expense of free speech.
I mean, what lessons would you say we could have drawn from the whole discussion around the death of George, or the killing of George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, the president's reaction, the dog whistles, I think you call it, that whole, we watch it from afar, but I mean, it's a debate which touches everybody's lives around the world. I mean, what are the takeaways for you when it comes to freedom of expression from that whole discussion?
Yeah, well, look, it's a great kind of explosion of freedom of expression in a certain sense. I mean, people coming out onto the streets, finding their voices, catalyzing public debate at an unprecedented pace. I mean, we've seen the shifts in public opinion over policing in the United States over the last few months. I was listening to a pollster speak, and he said there's been nothing like it in terms of the speed of the transformation in public opinion. The only other thing was gay marriage, where there again opinions change very quickly. But this has been really kind of a catalytic sea change for our country, and a reckoning and an awareness that we have this unfinished business of the legacy of racism that has to be confronted. And I think it has a lot to do with Trump. I think Trump has created an enabling environment for hatred and bigotry through his attacks on women, on minorities, on immigrants, on his antagonists, and a sort of nasty noxiousness that has triggered a reaction on the other side to be more mindful and cognizant of the dangers of hateful speech, to be less tolerant of it, to see it as more dangerous, kind of understandably, because it's one thing if it's just a couple of people that you're overhearing in a park. It's another thing if it's an agenda that you believe has taken over the highest levels of the US government. And so that has generated a sense of alarm and a sense of solidarity among many Americans that we have to fight back. And that's why you continue to see so many people there out on the streets pushing back against what, it seems to be a very potent force led by the president, but with many supporters trying to, essentially turn the tables and turn back the clock on a society that is rapidly becoming much more demographically diverse, that will not have any single demographic majority in the coming decades. And he has really fed off of fears of that. And yet on the flip side, there's this very powerful movement to embrace that and to take that through to its logical conclusion by dismantling these persistent barriers of exclusion that have kept certain groups down. So it's a powerful moment. I mean, such a complex moment, because obviously we're dealing with the pandemic at the same time, and that has had a very disparate impact on particular groups in the United States. But I think it's a hopeful time, and I'd say my agenda with this is to ensure that as we drive forward to the next level of equality and inclusion in the United States, that free speech must not be a casualty of that. And I think there's some real risk, and there's a sense, Sir Trump styles himself at times as a champion of free speech. He's anything but his invoking of the First Amendment has tainted the cause in the eyes of many in a rising generation. And so I think it's particularly important to articulate why free speech is so important to progressives and the left.
We hear increasingly the phrase cancel culture, okay? Not everybody hears that familiar with it. So could you maybe give a description of it and how it manifests itself in
Yeah, sure.
terms?
I'd say the term cancel is essentially when an individual is shunned, and it can be sort of socially, professionally, in the media. And the problem I have with the term cancel culture is that cancellation, it's used incredibly elastically. So cancellation can be anything from a Harvey Weinstein or a Bill Cosby who have been convicted of crimes and, as a result become discredited and essentially untouchable. And, that's something really nobody would much disagree with because of the misdeeds that they have performed and the belief that they must be held accountable and, frankly, a sense of disgust. On the other end of the spectrum, though, you have these cases where an individual, puts out an errant tweet that maybe says something insensitively or is critical of the Black Lives Matter movement or maybe questions the agenda to defund the police or stands up for police officers who were perhaps harsh on a protester. And we've seen in some instances there can be a very powerful outcry where even a single message can elicit calls for that individual to, for example, be fired from a tenured position at a US university because they are racist. And that I would say is the part of cancel culture that really generates the concern and the debate. It's a sense that this demand for institutional punishments of speech, whether it's by a corporation or a private university, are censorious, overbearing, too harsh, disproportionate to whatever offense has been committed, and sort of disallow space for apologies, forgiveness, contrition, and more de-escalatory ways of dealing with some of the inevitable frictions that we're going to have in a diverse society, and one in which we want people to be able to express opinions that depart from the orthodoxy.
There was the example of the Tom Cotton opinion piece in the New York Times, which led to the James Bennett, who was the opinion and editorial page editor's resignation. What did you think of that?
Yeah,
Should the New York Times have published that? I mean, or maybe you should explain to our readers what the opinion piece actually was, because he
Yeah, sure. So this was during sort of one of the most pitched moments of the post George Floyd murder protests across the country. And people were out in the streets every night in American cities, and there were quite a lot of clashes with police. In some instances, police were engaging in what seemed like brutalizing behavior and excessive force in containing the protests. And in the middle of that, Tom Cotton, a senator, wrote a piece arguing for the deployment of federal troops to essentially quash the protests, and that this was getting out of hand, that there were looters, which was true in a few instances, but overwhelmingly the protests were by and large peaceful. So he was calling for a harsh militarized response. And it seemed at the time that President Trump was inclined that way as well. There was the whole incident outside the White House in Lafayette Park, where a group of peaceful demonstrators were sort of forcibly cleared with tear gas and water and other tactics. And, you saw an Australian journalist being clobbered. And, it was also that President Trump could have a photo opportunity in front of a church there and try to assert a measure of control. And so there was this sort of feeling that this op-ed really fed into a harsh and punitive official response to the protests. And so New York Times journalists mounted a Twitter campaign saying that the publication of this op-ed made them feel unsafe. And apparently that was a kind of form of expression that sort of under workplace compensation law sort of gave them an extra measure of protection in terms of being able to speak out on what was cast as a health and safety issue. And that triggered a huge uproar, kind of going well beyond the walls of the New York Times. And ultimately, James Bennett, the opinion editor, was essentially forced to resign, and his deputy also came off the masthead. And look, it's hard to, I think the judgment call in terms of publishing the op-ed, and then there were also people who argued, and the Times actually acknowledged that there were some factual errors in the op-ed, although I think whether they were really matters of fact or opinion perhaps is debatable. So I think the judgment call was a weighty one to publish a piece like that, in this kind of incendiary moment. To me, it's always upsetting to see an editor be fired over a single editorial decision, because we know that editors can make mistakes. They're only human. You want them to feel that they will be supported if the decision that they made was reasoned and rational, and that there should be some room to take risks. And the fear is, of course, that a great climate of caution sets in at a place like the New York Times op-ed page, where it's incredibly influential, and ideas that are explored there can really take off and kindle mass movements and shift opinion. And so you want those editors to feel that their judgment calls will be supported, and that there's space to provide a forum for a wide breadth of views. And there's a lot of criticism and questioning over whether the Times is able to do that successfully. They have a number of conservative commentators. I think the one thing in that case that to me did sort of linger as troubling on the other side is the fact that Bennett said he hadn't read the piece. And to me, at a time like that, either that suggests they didn't have the measure of the moment in the United States, in the media environment in which they were operating, to recognize that this was an extremely fraught sort of tinderbox moment, and that a piece like that needed extra scrutiny, and that if they were missing the process that would have flagged it and escalated, I would have thought the publisher would have read a piece like that before it came into print. And so that to me did suggest some lapse.
Yeah, that struck me. If Bennett had said, I read it, he's a senator, this is an important American moment, that's his opinion, we published it. But the fact he came out and said, I hadn't read it, kind of struck me. That was radioactive, that piece. Everybody should have read it, up to Mr. Sulzberger, who we were delighted to host here a couple of years ago. I have a question from Keith Richburg, who's sitting beside me, former very renowned Washington Post correspondent, now the head of the Hong Kong University Journalism School. He said Ian Baruma is that, lost his job as editor of the New York Review of Books for running an article by a man who wrote he was unfairly targeted by the Me Too movement. Do you know about this case?
Yeah, I do. I did actually write about it in the book.
And what do you think, and Keith just asked, what do you think about this idea of an editor losing his job for running an unpopular or politically incorrect article? So it sort of follows on from the James Bennett discussion.
Yeah,
so
no, I agree. I mean, I think about Baruma every time the Bennett case comes up because, there's certain parallels. I mean, that was a piece that was by a Canadian journalist and commentator, Gian Ghomeshi, and he had been the subject of multiple allegations of sexual abuse. He ultimately was not convicted, although he signed something called a peace bond in Canada, which is, I gather, some sort of an admission of guilt. And he wrote this kind of apologia in the review, from the perspective of a Me Too accused. And the piece was criticized for sort of giving him free rein for a lengthy self-justification, and also the failure to verify certain facts, speak to or offer a right of reply to the women who had accused him. And so I think there were some genuine problems with the piece, and it may have been a misjudgment to publish it, but the fact that he was out of his job within days, again, sends this chilling message that, why on earth would you publish anything that departs from the conventional wisdom on a hot topic like policing protesters or Me Too, because it's only, risks getting you in trouble. And if not everybody agrees with it, the momentum can build and the punishment can be a very harsh one. I think a better approach would be, in the wake of something like that, dialogue, looking at policies, a full airing of the set of views about a piece like that, and really approaching thoughtfully how you're going to go forward. But the kind of draconian ouster of these editors, I worry that has a constricting effect on what we're going to see in print going forward.
So, I mean, that raises the question of self-censorship. One thing that I discovered in the book, which I'd never heard of, was what you called sensitivity readers, which you describe as hired reviewers hired by authors and publishing houses to screen manuscripts and flag issues that may ignite controversy or provoke charges of racial, ethnic, gender, or other forms of callousness. I mean, there's a lot of books wouldn't have come to print if they'd had sensitivity readers at the time. So, I mean, as someone who's just published a book, did you have a sensitivity reader?
It's a good question. Sort of. I mean, I had people read the manuscript with a view to, how things might be misconstrued and whether, anything I was saying was coming across as really as something other than what I wanted to say. I mean, my goal with this book was not to offend anyone. It was to set out this series of arguments. And so I wanted to make sure I didn't thwart that objective by, through some inartful phrasing or anachronistic reference or, obliviousness about the sensitivities of a particular group. And so, this has become a very real phenomenon. And I talk in the book about how publishing houses do this, and they actually go out and hire people. If there's a story that has a major, for example, Black character or a transgender character or immigrant character, they often will hire somebody from that group to give their own lens to the book and sort of say whether they think the depiction is accurate and fair, whether there are things that don't ring true, whether there are things that might be construed as offensive. And I think at some level, it is a valid impulse. We're all in the United States, we have a very diverse and increasingly diverse society. And so you're not just writing for, I think centuries or decades ago, even, you'd be writing for a much more finite and kind of knowable audience. It might be an audience, that you can imagine consisting primarily of people like you, or at least the voluble among them. Those who might come out and criticize, would be perhaps other kind of white men of a certain age, born and bred in the United States. Now that's not true. And your work is going to be read by, and you want it to be read by audiences from all kinds of backgrounds, work travels across borders. It may be read in a cultural context that you've never before considered. And so some forethought about what it means to be writing for audiences unlike yourself, and some anticipation of how something may be received, and sort of, it's like a 360-degree awareness. Where are, what are the risks here that I can't see because of, the orientation that I have. So I think in a sense, it's a very valid impulse. I know we all, and I'm sure, everybody on this call is used to running work past other people, for a second pair of eyes for similar reasons. I also do think there's a risk that it can go too far, and that, the effort to avoid all controversy can end up really depriving storytelling of its robustness and vigor and edginess. And, I think we're sort of teetering at that point right now, because it's such a, tripwire moment in terms of these sensitivities in our society. And there's very little leeway for satire or jokes. I mean, we have this interesting debate in the US, believe it or not, over Trader Joe, the supermarket chain, and they have certain products where they have, a Mexican product that's called like Trader Jose, and a kind of Asian inflected product that's called Trader Ming. And there was a campaign to get them to get rid of these names on the basis that they're stereotypical and they're derogatory. And Trader Joe has actually said no. They've said actually a lot of people like these names, and here's how they originated, and we're just sort of, trying to be a little bit funny and celebrate different cultures. And so it was sort of one of the first instances of any kind of institutional resistance to this that we've seen. So, I think we're in a particularly kind of fraught moment where there's a risk that these measures go too far, and that what we want to get to is a level of conscientiousness and awareness, but one that does not, that still leaves space for the airing of unorthodox perspectives and for risk taking.
One thing you said in the book is we should be willing to consider forgiving errant speech. I mean, the kind of ill-considered tweet when you've had 2 or 3 more drinks than you should have had in an airport lounge, which happened to one person who was, I think, on a flight to South Africa and destroyed her reputation forever. It made a extremely bad taste joke, and when she got off the plane, that was the end of her career. What about one thing you also say is a prison sentence has a limit, but online shaming doesn't. So how do you balance this between, at what point do you forgive somebody, or on the other hand, so often, I think quite recently there was an incident, some white supremacist was waving a Confederate flag at Black Lives Matter protesters, and then when they were called out online, said, this is not the person I am. It's never the person they are when it becomes public, Was it the person they were up until that moment that they lost their job? So right. What would you say should there be a statute of limitations? I'm not talking about Harvey Weinstein, I'm just talking about ill-considered jokes, behavior. People go to the supermarkets in America now. They're just constantly followed by people with phones, and they're instantly uploading them. This kind of shaming culture, where does it end? What is right? What is justifiable, and what is just?
Yeah, I talk about a few different principles. One is how to apologize, and a genuine apology. And I think that can go a long way. And when someone does persuasively and authentically apologize, I think it should count for a lot. And I talk about the elements of that. It has to be self-reflective, it has to be comprehensive, it has to be timely. It can't be something that the person is clearly doing just because they want to alleviate whatever consequences have come their way. They've got to reach out and make clear if their comments evinced ignorance, that they're taking steps to overcome that ignorance. I mean, we had an interesting incident. I don't know if this made it all the way to Hong Kong, but it was certainly prominent here within the last couple of weeks, where there was a member of Congress from Florida who called Alessandra Ocasio-Cortez, who's a kind of newly elected superstar in the U.S. Congress, and he used a kind of very typical slur, sexist slur that starts with B and is used against women in reference to Ocasio-Cortez. And the next day he gave an apology that was sort of a classic pseudo-apology. First of all, he denied it, so there was no sort of owning up or taking accountability. And then he went on about how he has a wife and daughters, and so he's someone who knows women and gets along with women, as if this excused this clear kind of use of a slur in the workplace to a colleague. And so that was clearly a failed apology, and in fact energized her attack on him, which was quite persuasive. But there are also examples that I give in the book of effective apologies where it's clear that there is genuine remorse. And I think in those instances, there should be space for forgiveness. I mean, we saw it in the case of this incident. We had a crazy incident in Central Park. I don't know if this made it to Hong Kong either. I can see you're nodding, where you had a woman out with her dog, a white woman, and you had a black man who was out bird watching with binoculars, and she had her dog off leash in a part of the park where you're not supposed to. And he was telling her to put the dog on the leash, and she essentially called the police and said, there's a black man threatening me in the park, and made it out as if it was a much more confrontational and sort of risky encounter than it was. And he videoed the whole thing, so you could see it was all very kind of calm. And so, she lost her job and she became kind of a national pariah, and it was a huge incident. But then when the district attorney actually wanted to prosecute her for making a false police report, the bird watcher declined to participate. He sort of said, look, she's had punishment enough, and we don't need to add and heap on here. And I think what that evinced was sort of a sense of proportionality. I mean, she'd had a harsh punishment, and what she did, pretty clearly evinced a measure of racism. But he was ready to be done with it. And what worries me is, first of all, there can be a reflexiveness to the punitive impulse. People see the tweet and there's no effort to inquire into the intent, the context. Who is this person? Do they have a track record of bigotry? Might this be something, that was fired off unthinkingly, not realizing how it would be received or how it might be interpreted? And, very often there's no inquiry into any of those factors. Instead, there's just sort of this reflexive reaction to say, isn't this an outrage? And I think social media fuels that, because there's a premium put on immediacy, on pithiness, on wittiness, on being the first one to make the pun in response to what was just said. And that cuts against the kind of measured, thoughtful effort to really understand each other and avoid overreacting to speech.
I have another question from Keith, and this is actually something you touch on in the book, which is, do you think a fiction author can write about characters from another race or ethnic group or another gender? Can a white author write about black characters or vice versa? Can a straight author write about LGBTQI persons? Some people call that cultural appropriation. What do you think? And you gave a particular example in your book about an author who, I think he'd called out people for this and then did it himself on a story in, was it in Kosovo, I think? Yeah.
Yeah, it was sort of a young man of color who had been part of this, what's called in the US, the Own Stories movement, which is basically a movement that says, if you're going to publish a book about Black characters or Latino characters, it ought to be written by somebody from that group. And I'll come back in a minute to your larger question, but then this author ends up writing a sort of semi-historical novel about Kosovar, the Kosovo War, and then he is flamed for not being Kosovar and taking on this story, and what right does he have? And so, yeah, I think what that illustrates is the real danger of putting parameters on the imagination and trying to dictate, you are only allowed to write a story about a journalist in Hong Kong, or maybe you could also write about Britain if you lived for a while there, but how dare you write about France or Miami? And kind of, where does it end? Can you write about somebody who's in a different socioeconomic bracket, a different age group, a different religion? And I think what we want as defenders of free speech is for those parameters to be as wide as possible. With that said, I'll tell you, what I think is really behind this own stories movement and the arguments over cultural appropriation is a frustration with the barriers that persist in relation to opportunities to be heard, to publish books, to enter journalism, be in newsrooms, be decision makers when it comes to our cultural products and output. And so what I see is that pent up frustration in publishing in particular, which is an industry we're quite close to at PEN America, remains very white. There's statistics published every year that document this, and there a variety of reasons for it, but it just hasn't moved very quickly. You've actually seen the last couple months, it's interesting, a number of very prominent high-level Black women in particular being appointed to senior roles in publishing houses. So there is a kind of a belated awakening that is happening, but I think the frustration over that exclusion and over the relative paucity of major book releases by authors of color has sort of spurred this own stories movement. And until we achieve better equity and representativity in the industries, I think you're still going to get that sense that, until authors of color have full ability to participate, it's very frustrating to see a white author telling, the story of a Mexican immigrant with a huge book advance and a splashy release when so many other people seem to be shut out. So I think there's some legitimacy to that. I think the call for actual rules on who's allowed to tell what story really go too far, and that ultimately we want to get to a point where the barriers to access and opportunity are lowered, and we all agree that anyone can tell whatever story they choose. How you tell the story, I mean, this goes back to sort of the sensitivity reader. I do think you have to be mindful, and there's sort of an extra burden of care that you do have to take when you're writing about a population that you don't know as well. And it's like, it's like in journalism. I mean, you have to do your research. You have to make sure you get it right.
So let's come a bit closer to home for us and all of us in Hong Kong. And I mean, you're a great friend of the FCC. We always welcome you here. Next time your next book, we can have the discussion in the club, I hope, Suzanne. But in 2018, I think you referred to it in the book, you published Forbidden Feeds, which was a report on this online repression in China. I wanted to ask you, how concerned are you about China's attempts to stifle speech about China outside of China, beyond the borders? For example, when the Houston Rockets basketball team general manager, Daryl Morey, I think that's how you pronounce it, he tweeted support for the demonstrators in Hong Kong. And the Chinese government, the government protested, and there was calls for him to be fired. Finally, the NBA didn't, but it comes with a big weight. I mean, there's a big financial pressure there. So do you sense that, this outreach or overreach of the Chinese government to try to censor speech about China outside of China?
Definitely. I think it's very worrying. You see it in academia where scholars are kind of often faced with this sort of Hobson's choice of they, can have to withhold all criticism or lose all access and the ability to travel in and out of China. And so, that I think is stifling the openness on campus in terms of the dialogue about China. You have this spread of these Confucius centers that are funded by Chinese Cultural Ministry and are doing the Chinese language instruction, and centers for purportedly the exploration of Chinese culture, but with strict boundaries in terms of what can and can't be discussed there. We actually have a report coming out very shortly about Chinese influence in Hollywood, where Chinese investors and business partners and the prospect of access to the very lucrative and large Chinese market for films has really been sort of internalized by Hollywood filmmakers in terms of their own calculations and what stories they will and won't tell. And, you know, you think about the story of how are we going to tell the story of the coronavirus? You know, Hollywood there'll be movies for decades about this pandemic, the way, you know, there's still movies coming out about, you know, World War II or the Cold War. And, you know, if there is a fear of telling the story in a certain way, because that may foreclose your studio's opportunities to engage with the Chinese market, you know, how does that shape public opinion and public understanding of this massive health crisis? So, you know, I think it's very concerning, and that as Western organizations and institutions dedicated to free expression, there needs to be much more cognizance and vigilance about this. Because I think if Beijing had its way, they would rewrite the rules. You know, free expression is not a principle that really works for them in the domestic context. And I think if to the degree that they can syndicate their view of it globally, I think they'll try to do so and insulate themselves from criticism and scrutiny, and, you know, use opportunities to burnish their image. So, you know, to me, it's a serious concern.
At the same time, you have an American president who keeps referring to it as a China virus. I mean, that's just stoking anti-Asian American, anti-Chinese sentiment. So,
I mean, you know, that's important too, because I think we need to be able to talk about this without it veering into a, you know, hostile standoff between two superpowers or an ethnocentric, you know, kind of finger pointing discussion. And at Penn, you know, we've always done a lot of work on China. We work with a lot of Chinese writers. You know, we believe very fundamentally in the importance of connections across borders and dialogue and exchange and, you know, traveling to China and Hong Kong. And so it's you know, we also have fought back against anti-Asian American prejudice that has reared its head in our own country in the wake of or as we deal with the coronavirus. Unfortunately, we're not in the wake of it yet. So, you know, I think you have to be able to hold all these things in your head at once, and not assume that just because you're talking about, you know, Beijing's effort at, you know, cultural and political and economic influence and influence over expression around the world, you know, is a fact. And, you know, anti-Chinese sentiment and hostility stoked by President Trump, you know, is another fact. And the two sort of don't negate each other.
Which brings us to Hong Kong, the national security law, which I'm sure you've followed. I've got a question from our club president, Jody Schneider, who's a sort of senior international editor at Bloomberg. She said, how concerned are you about attempts in Hong Kong to take books off the shelves in libraries? This was a preemptive strike just after the law was adopted that these books just vanished. And we're going to be studied to see if they were within the law. And Jody also says, is this happening in other places? I mean, what's your feeling about that? I mean, it brings back obviously memories of book burning in other contexts. And then maybe a more large, broader question, just your reaction on this national security law that just came in.
You know, I think it's alarming. You know, we've been documenting for some years the encroaching environment for free expression in Hong Kong. I I don't think it's surprising. I mean, when we first began that work, I think, there was a recognition that Beijing was closing in and that they, ultimately push would probably come to shove and we would see something like this. I think what you see in Beijing, and we document in that Forbidden Feeds report and another report that we did some years ago about censorship and the publication of Western books on the mainland, is that individuals sort of internalize what the parameters of the permissible are. And so if you're a bookseller and you know other booksellers have been disappeared and the law has just changed and there's much less tolerance, you're going to be prudent and, why take the risks? That, should you get into hot water, the consequences will be dire. And, your ability to fight back, given the institutional weakness in Hong Kong and the pressures that are being put upon, courts, the legislatures, and every other structure of society really are too great to withstand. And so I think you're going to see a lot of sort of preemptive, just capitulation. And people are closing down. I know people are closing down their social media accounts and being very careful about what they say and write. And it's an understandable impulse. Born of self-protection. This is not an environment. I mean, in the U.S., you could take a risk and know there are going to be strong civil society organizations that will, like the ACLU, that will stand by you if your rights are violated, that you may get a day in court and you could be vindicated. In the Chinese system, and as Hong Kong comes under the heavier thumb of the Chinese system, that's not the case. And so I think we face really difficult questions about how to approach this environment and how to try to sustain any space for open dialogue, publication, and vibrant intellectual life. And it's very poignant because I know you all know much better than I do what it has been like in Hong Kong and what a dynamic intellectual, cultural, social, and political life has thrived there. So to see that being sort of steadily shut down is very painful. And I don't need to tell you that.
And PEN obviously has as we know, has an international reach. I mean, globally, and in particular in the past 4 years with Trump's criticism, enemies of the people, which he repeated again yesterday, I think, and fake news. How would you assess the situation of freedom of expression, freedom of speech around the world? I think in the book you say you're intervening as PEN in more countries which previously were quite thriving liberal democracies, and they've turned to a much more repressive sort of context.
Excuse me. Yeah, look, it's a moment of global retreat for democracy and freedom. And you see, I think it's now 14 years of steady declines in Freedom House's index of measuring freedom in the world. You see a lot of democracies, Poland, Hungary, the Philippines, Turkey, that have moved, strongly in the direction of authoritarianism. The U.S. leadership is abdicated when it comes to press freedom, human rights, the role of journalists, the president's comments, the hundreds of incidents of infringement on press freedom rights in the context of the protests, render Washington's voice, completely lacking in credibility. Can that be restored in the future? Maybe. It's going to take some work, but I think it's a dangerous moment. I mean, where is the leadership on these issues? Even in a place like the UN, you see a kind of Chinese influence is growing and the willingness to speak out is diminishing. I notice, Eric, there's a couple questions in the chat that I'm happy to answer. I know we have to wrap up pretty soon, but I want to make sure people.
Sure.
Do you see
I
them?
don't have the chat.
Okay,
Yeah.
So the first is your thoughts on misinformation and fake news. Does clamping down on fake news constitute an infringement on free speech? So after the 2016 election, when we all became aware of the role that fake news, I prefer the term fraudulent news because Trump uses fake news to refer to any news he doesn't like, but deliberate disinformation. We did an analysis in a report called Faking the News that is, it really spells out how fake news, it does constitute a threat to free expression, even though most of it, overwhelmingly, it's protected by the First Amendment. It constitutes free speech, and yet it can also threaten open fact-based discourse. And so we actually have been doing a lot of work on disinformation in the context of the pandemic and the election. It's difficult because I think ultimately you can't control it or turn it off at the source. You can moderate it on social media, and the social media companies are learning how to do that better. But you also, I believe, have to inoculate individuals so that they are better equipped to spot fake news, to prevent themselves from being vectors, to spread it, to validate and verify information before they pass it along. And so it's a real cultural change that we need to effectuate. The next question is, are there ideas that deserve to be canceled, i.e. misinformation?
Yeah, that's from Christy Lou Stout. You know Christy, CNN anchor. Are there some ideas that should be cancelled, like misinformation or fake news, racist slurs, sexism, hate speech, or propaganda? I mean, should they just be cancelled?
I think, yeah, there are, I wouldn't necessarily call them ideas. A slur to me is not an idea. And I think we have to draw a distinction between somebody who's trying to make an argument or ask a question or debate some aspect of how we see things, and someone who is simply trying to insult, denigrate, demean, confuse, or obfuscate. And I don't think by any means that all speech is equally valid or valuable. I think there are certain forms of speech, and you list them out, that deserve to be rejected, condemned, banned from, discretionary, not banned by government, but that, an op-ed editor should certainly not put into print. So I do think we absolutely have to be discerning between ideas. What I don't believe in is expanding the powers of government to clamp down on speech, because I think on balance, we can't trust how those powers will be used. And we know that in the long run, they're likely to be used in very self-serving ways. So we may be asking government to ban misinformation or sexist speech, but how they define misinformation, and Trump is a perfect example of this, may not be how we do. And once you give them that power, they will exercise it as they see fit, and their successors in office will do so. And so I think that the idea embedded in international law and in the US First Amendment that we ought to sharply constrain the discretion of government to police speech remains a good one. Online, it's more complicated, and I think we do need companies to assume more accountability for harmful speech emanating from their platforms. And I talk about that in several chapters of the book.
Suzanne, I think one of the chapters is called, or one of the lines is, beware expanded corporate controls on speech.
That's right. I mean, I sort of look at it from
So you're
both
talking
sides.
about the platforms.
Yeah, I think there's great reason to be leery of giving platforms unfettered discretion. They're non-transparent. They don't want to be held accountable. They have their own corporate and profit-making interests. They have their own ideologies. They don't tend to do a good job with moderation and practice. So I sort of go through all the reasons to be leery of this, of giving them sort of a limitless, particularly without any transparency or ability to evaluate what speech is disappearing. But what I talk about in the next chapter is the fact that the harms of online speech have multiplied and escalated, and that we do need them to take more responsibility. And I lay out some principles for that. And I'd say the most important, I put out an idea for a global independent content defender, recognizing that the platforms will become and are becoming, as we speak, far more aggressive in policing misinformation. I think we need a much more ready recourse for users who believe that their speech has been improperly or unjustifiably demoted, deleted, their account has been shut down. You know, right now, forget about getting somebody on the phone, even often understanding what you did wrong or what rule you violated, much less getting your content restored if the decision was an improper one. And so I think much more needs to be done. As they get more aggressive in policing, we need a fail-safe for the inevitable false positives that will result in speech disappearing without good reason.
Okay. I think we're just about out of time. I just want to ask two more questions, actually. Margaret Sullivan in the Washington Post wrote a comment piece and the headline was, "This was the week America lost the war on misinformation." It was a reference to the doctors in their white coats standing in the steps of the Supreme Court promoting hydroxychloroquine, saying we shouldn't wear masks, people should go back to school. And this was just shared millions and millions of time on social media. So Margaret Sullivan said, with nearly 150, well, that was before the 150,000 dead from COVID-19, we've not only lost the public health war, we've lost the war for truth. Misinformation and lies have captured the castle. So how do you square the defense of freedom of speech with the right to spread dangerous health from misinformation? And last week we had Kristen Urquiza, whose father, who started this movement called Marked by COVID after her father died of COVID-19 in Arizona by believing a lot of the lies and disinformation there is about the disease, and that he felt safe to go out and he caught the virus and died. So how do you square the public health interests with the freedom of speech?
You know, for me, I think one of the things the platforms have done a good job with in the last few months is elevating credible information. So if you are on Facebook or Google and you do a search on COVID, the first things that will come up will be information from the CDC, from national health authorities, the World Health Organization. And so elevating credible information, I think, is an important part of it. They've also, you know, voluntarily suppressed and expunged a great deal of misinformation, quackery, conspiracy theories, and I think that's been important. I do think you need, again, a fail-safe to ensure that where, you know, if there's a doctor who is, you know, having success with certain treatments that are not harmful and wants to share that information, you know, I think there should be space to do that. I mean, I happen to be on this listserv of COVID survivors, even though I'm not one, but, you know, people share information about, you know, here's what worked for me, or I breathed, and, you know, here's a method of breathing. And, you know, there's a certain amount of that I think you want to flow freely. And I think by giving, you know, the risk, and Trump is the perfect illustration. If you gave the government unfettered power to dictate what could and couldn't be published about COVID, I think a lot more people would have been injured by hydroxychloroquine than was the case, because the president believed in that, and for whatever, you know, unfathomable reason, you know, was on an agenda for a long time, and maybe to this day, to promote it. I mean, I think what we see obviously is that, you know, the turning of the backs of our government against science, and the muzzling of the scientists, and the politicization of the science has had devastating, deadly results. But I think, you know, Trump, I think, is the perfect illustration of why empowering government to more aggressively police speech is not the solution.
One final question from Jody Snyder, our club president, on a slightly lighter note, I think it's fair to say. She says, what is the CEO of PEN America reading this summer? What are your book recommendations in this summer like no other summer?
Well, okay, two things. There's Zadie Smith has a new book of essays on her experiences and interpretations of COVID-19. And we're actually doing an event, a PEN America event tomorrow focused on that book. So if you want to join, you can let Eric know. And it's at 1 p.m. EST, so it's 1 in the morning your time. Not very appealing, but I'm reading her book in preparation for that. And I'm a former diplomat, so I'm kind of I have a soft spot for diplomatic history. And believe it or not, I'm reading John Bolton's The Room Where It Happened. And I love the story of the policy making behind the scenes, and in the Trump White House, it's just so crazy. And you could sort of you could feel Bolton's temperature going up steadily page by page. So it makes for an interesting read.
Well, he was in the kind of virtual room where it happened, 2 or 3 weeks ago, hosted by Keith Richburg, who's sitting beside me. So, and do you think a lot of people are also rereading 1984?
Yeah, I mean, we gave that out, or we had a signed copy at our gala back in 2017. I mean, although I don't think even then, we foresaw this. I mean, the gravity here in the United States, I don't know if you have a sense of it, but it is, it's really quite sort of frightening to live through.
Well, great, Suzanne. Thank you very much. That was fascinating. And good luck with the rest of your virtual tour. I hope to host you again soon in the
That would be
FCP
great.
Hong Kong.
Yeah, I would love
Thank
to.
you.
Okay, take care.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.